Wherever you are. I'm Maha Yahya. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Maha Yahya. I'm the director of the Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut. I'd like to welcome you today to this discussion on the ongoing conflict, the unfolding conflict in Ukraine and its potential impact on the Middle East and North African countries. Today, I have with me four phenomenal speakers and colleagues. There is first my friend Emma Beers, who is a senior analyst at the European Institute for Peace, who works specifically on Syria. Paul Stronsky, my colleague, who's also a senior fellow at the Carnegie Russia and Eurasia program. His research focuses on the relationship between Russia and neighboring countries in Central Asia and the South Caucasus. Sinan Ulgun, also my colleague and visiting scholar at Carnegie Europe in Brussels, where his research focuses on Turkish foreign policy, nuclear policy, cyber policy, and transatlantic relations. And last but not least, my friend and colleague, founder and editor of the Syria report, Jihad Yazji, who's also a visiting fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. And Jihad focuses mainly on publishing reports on Syria's war economy. As you all know, the conflict in in Ukraine. Excuse, please, the Freudian slip, I guess. But the conflict in Ukraine has been going on now for a couple of weeks, and there's the first, second, and order. We're still trying to come to terms. First, second, and third order consequences of this conflict. I'm going to start with a question to Paul, just for us to begin on the kind of the global impact of this conflict. So the war now is clearly not going the way President Putin had initially hoped it would go. He clearly underestimated both Western resolve as well as Ukrainian resistance. So what are the scenarios that you see moving forward as we move out of this?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, and it's great to speak to all of you today. The first thing for somebody who watches Russia and Ukraine fairly closely, I think the most important thing to highlight is that even 2 months ago, we could not imagine the scale of this war, or even the fact that Russia and that Putin would actually do this, that he would, wage such a brutal war against a country that he has long described as a fraternal nation to Russia. So this is really quite troubling. And I would just like to say the outlook moving forward is quite grim. The war looks like it's going to continue without any end in sight. And even if a deal is struck in the next few days, weeks, there's certainly been an uptick in talks. The Russians, as you mentioned, this war is not going as the Russians had thought. They, I believe, failed to prepare their population and also their army for a longer war, assuming that the Ukrainian government would quickly collapse, that people would meet the Russian soldiers with flowers, and that they could quickly install a puppet government. But none of that has happened. Instead, we've seen a tremendous amount of resistance from both the Ukrainian army, but also volunteers who have just decided to line up with the Ukrainian army. What's most interesting about this is that most of this resistance and most of the bloody fighting and the bombings you are seeing are actually happening in the Russian-speaking areas of Ukraine. So these are ethnic Russians who are pushing back. So Putin clearly misjudged both the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainians' government's willingness to withstand. The country is proven to be far more aligned and united across political, religious, and ethnic lines. And I do think they misjudged the West. These sanctions that they have are having deep impacts on broad areas of the country and are really kind of hurting. So what do we see? Right now there is some ceasefire talks. First we've had, and they're kind of going in two different directions. First is on humanitarian ceasefires that would allow non-combatants to evacuate major population centers, particularly in the east, and allow food and shipment and medicine in to those areas. However, both thus far, these are ongoing. These are very important, but Russia has not really adhered to the deals that it has already put out on the table, where they've only adhered to the deals for corridors that go to Russia, which is not where the populations of these cities generally want to go. And then there's a broader conversation that is actually seems to be taking place. It is, I've heard both from Russians, Ukrainians, and some American officials that there might be some hope that could stop the invasion. Attention in these discussions is whether Ukraine would declare its neutral status, its desire not to join NATO, and formally recognize claims, territorial claims to Crimea and the parts of eastern Ukraine that Russia controls. I would very much like to be proven wrong in this, but I really have a hard time seeing these negotiations going anywhere. They might have some short-term, stopping some of the violence, but Putin seems to be really keen on regaining control of this area, and I think a sovereign Ukraine still is a big pill for him to swallow, particularly after his government and his military has done a very poor job in this war. And then the sheer brutality of this war is going to make it very hard. Yes, the Ukrainians want peace. They want to return to their life. But even if this government, the Ukrainian government, concedes to Russia, to bring peace, I'm not sure all of the Ukrainians will go along with that. We've seen a much more invigorized Ukrainian civil society. We've seen that since the bottom-up revolution of 6 years ago. And I fear that even if there is a way to stop this war, either with a Russian-installed puppet government or Ukrainians coming to a ceasefire, I still fear that there will likely be insurgent elements continue to push against Russian movements. So while I hope I'm wrong, I just kind of don't see any good solution right now.
Thanks, Paul. We're going to come back actually to this issue of humanitarian corridors, and because we've seen this movie before, unfortunately, in Syria. So we will come back to some of this in a short while. But just as a quick follow-up, do you see this as a watershed moment for European defense and security, particularly in light, and there was a lot of concern at a certain moment, in light of the nuclear threat that President Putin has, just vocalized multiple times over?
Yeah, I think the nuclear threat is a clearly concerning one. Russia has always talked about how it would be willing to do this in a specific, in specific scenarios. And I think, a lot of us sort of thought it was bluster, but it has been part of their doctrine, and they are certainly now, pushing at that. What we are seeing is a remarkable amount of sort of European unity, both on the economic front and on the security front, of trying to deter Russia. But there's also there's a split inside of NATO. There are some countries, and the United States is one of them, that are very wary of getting directly involved because of the deep prospects for some sort of major escalation, including nuclear. And then you have the frontline states, Poland and Romania and the Baltic states that are much more willing to sort of push for things like no-fly zones and the like, which I think could be escalatory. And so, right now, there's unanimity in the desire to deter Russia, but with these increasing threats and the war increasingly, starting to move more towards the western part of the country, we are seeing some splits within, European security and sort of the alliance about how forceful NATO should be in its response and its deterrence, and whether to go in and provide greater air cover and we're starting to see some splits 3 weeks into the war.
Okay, well, that's actually also the question of the moment: is how long will this kind of unified front that we've seen in Europe last? Sinan, let me turn to you now and ask you first if you would like to comment particularly on the nuclear issue, and then we'll move to Turkey in a second.
Yes, very briefly on the nuclear issue, this has certainly been a wake-up call, because for long after the Cold War, the nuclear deterrence aspect of NATO was a bit, left behind. There were countries in Europe which wanted also to revise that policy in terms of the US tactical nuclear weapons that are deployed in Europe. Germany even tried to make this, with a formal agreement at some point, essentially because there was a belief that Europe was, safe from any sort of conventional and nuclear threat. Of course, now things have changed and quite drastically. And we shall see repercussions of this, not only in the meetings that are being held next week. There's going to be another NATO summit, but more so in the more long-term doctrines that are now being prepared on the EU side. Of course, we're talking about the strategic compass. On the NATO side, we're talking about the new strategic concept that will be launched in mid-2022, in June. So I think this is where we are going to see the major policy impact of what has happened. And one dimension of that will certainly be a renewed analysis and evaluation of NATO's nuclear deterrence.
Okay, thanks. Moving on to Turkey. I mean, Turkey is probably widely believed to be the country among the first in line to feel the fallout of the ongoing war in Ukraine. For the past decade, Russia and Turkey have been embroiled in what some have called an adversarial collaboration. They have multi-layered ties spanning from billions of dollars in trade, adversity and collaboration in Syria and Libya and Nagorno-Karabakh. And on the issue of Russia, Erdogan has kind of zigzagged a bit, going back and forth between a more muscular attitude, with the US and the UK, and then a more cautious approach. So how do you see, can you talk to us a little bit about where you see Turkey today, how it's been impacted, and what the implications of this will be on both the country, but also its positioning moving forward? We see President Erdogan also offering to host peace talks between the Russians and the Ukrainians.
Yes, thank you, Maha. I think it's really interesting to try to look at what Turkey is doing nowadays diplomatically. But let me start from the basic premise that, yes, indeed, the Turkey-Russia relationship can be defined as a collaborative, rivalry. It's a complex relationship where there are areas of collaboration and there are very clear areas of strategic dispute. But however, over the past 5-6 years, and perhaps the turning point is November 2015, when Turkey had downed a Russian plane, first for a NATO nation. Since then, things have moved in a rather unexpected direction of Turkey and Russia, and basically this was triggered by the political dialogue and relationship between Erdogan and Putin, being able to create areas of diplomatic engagement. Now, looking at Turkey today, where Turkey stands on Russia and the Russia-Ukraine war, is that firstly, the Turkish government is very well aware of its own vulnerabilities. Of course, many NATO nations have a degree of vulnerability towards Russia, particularly on the energy side. But in Turkey, there is more to it than energy, economy, and tourism. And here I particularly want to refer to Syria, where Turkey, since 2015, has partnered with Russia and to some extent with Iran to bring a degree of stability to Syria. And really chief among Turkish policy's concern has been to control the situation in Idlib, where any sort of regime advance with the green lighting of Russia could lead to a humanitarian disaster and sizable refugee flows to Turkey, which is the core scenario that Turkish policymakers want to prevent. And that's a degree of vulnerability and dependence on Russia that other NATO nations don't have. Mm-hmm. So this is if you want, the context. And in this context, Turkey tried to recalibrate its balancing policy towards Russia. Before the war, Turkey had a balanced approach to Russia. But of course, there's an acknowledgement that this policy cannot continue given the gravity of the situation, the heavy violation of Russia of international laws and norms. So now Turkey is trying to recalibrate this balanced policy. And in practice, this means a heightened political criticism of Russia. Erdogan has been quite clear on that. A decision to close the straits, which essentially affects Russian warships. But at the same time, Turkey not implementing its own set of sanctions against Russia. So there are no Turkish sanctions against Russia. The air corridor remains open. Now, incidentally, this creates a margin of maneuver for Turkish diplomacy, because Turkey has been also active on the diplomatic track as some would say as a facilitator, other would claim as a more than that, as a mediator. But I think the right term is good offices, because mediation is something more pronounced, more ambitious, and I don't think that we're at the point where Russia wants the mediation of any country. But it's more than facilitation, in the sense that the two foreign ministers of Ukraine and Russia have met in Turkey last week for the first time since the onset of the war. The Turkish Foreign Minister Çavuşoğlu is on a shuttle diplomacy visiting Moscow and then Kyiv. He was in Moscow yesterday and is in Kyiv today. So Turkey is perhaps the only country in NATO that can have this sort of diplomatic engagement with both capitals. And I think this is also a reason why there has not been a lot of pressure on Turkey to also implement the sanctions. But of course, the sustainability of this recalibrated balanced policy is also in doubt, given that the crisis in Ukraine may still reach more undesired states, and then there might be more pressure on Turkey to comply with the sanctions. But nonetheless, today this is the balancing act, very difficult, but so far I would argue quite successful balancing act that Turkey has tried to carry out.
Thanks, Sinan. We're going to come back to Turkey once we start talking about Syria and the impact there. But let me move on to Jihad at this point, and maybe talk a little bit about the global impacts of the conflict, the global economic impacts of the Ukraine conflict in general, but also on the MENA region in particular, especially fragile or conflict countries like Lebanon and Syria. Can you perhaps just get us going on that level, and then we'll move into more detail?
Yes, thank you, Maha. Thanks also to Mohannad and Josiane for organizing this. I think unsurprisingly, the conflict has had an impact on oil prices and energy prices, which is something, of course, which matters a lot in the Middle East region. But I think what is new this time, contrary to other major wars or crises that have had an impact on oil prices, it is that this time we have something which is which will have longer-term impact. What I mean by that is that, as we all know, the EU imports a lot of its gas from Russia. It depends a lot for its gas on Russia. But actually what is less known is that it imports a lot of its oil from Russia. Actually, around a fifth of EU oil is imported from Russia. And clearly there is a desire by the European states by the EU to reduce their dependency on Russia for energy imports, and this is going to certainly lead to long-term deals, long-term strategic relationship between the EU and the main oil exporting countries, which are in the Middle Eastern region. And so this is also going to create an increased leverage, if you want, of these countries. We have already seen the impact of it. For instance, the visit of Boris Johnson to MBS yesterday, while MBS was largely ignored by Western governments. Well, now, whether it's Saudi Arabia or the UAE or Kuwait or Qatar on the gas side, of course, they are going to have a much significant leverage in their relation with the West. But what is a country that is likely to, which potentially can benefit also from the situation, is Iran, and that's the country we don't talk enough about it. But to make up for for replacing the Russian oil and Russian gas. I don't know where that's going to come from if Iran is not included. As you know, Iran has very large also gas reserves, although they're underexploited. But I think that we are likely to see an interest of the EU to engage more systematically with Middle Eastern countries and commit to long-term contracts. Another area in our region that is going to benefit from that is the East Med region. And here we are talking of Egypt, we are talking of Israel, of course, maybe even Lebanon, which has potentially some reserves. And it could be that actually we see in the next few weeks or months more significant interest by the EU in investing in Lebanese offshore waters. Now, so when it comes to wheat supplies and food supplies, I think this is something which has been discussed a lot. We all know the dependency of very fragile countries such as Lebanon and Syria on wheat imports from the Black Sea countries. Now, what I would say here is that certainly the impact is going to be very harsh this year, potentially next year, because the planting season in the Black Sea countries is going to be impacted. But I don't see the change, if you want, the impact as strategic and as long term as it is for the energy products. Now, of course, in the case of Syria or of Lebanon, these two countries are extremely fragile with a very difficult socioeconomic situation, and that is what is worrying and should be watched in the next few months, even in the next couple of years.
Thanks, Jihad. Indeed, we're already seeing the oil-producing countries mainly using the crisis to try and extract as much concession as they can. We haven't talked about the Iran deal either, and the JCPOA, and the likelihood of, the increased pressure now to get that deal through in whatever form, irrespective of the ongoing conflict. But we will come back to this in a second. Let me turn now to Emma. Since we're talking, we've sort of moved a bit into Syria and the conflict. I wanted to ask you, Emma, about the impact of the conflict on humanitarian aid and the space for humanitarian aid. There's a lot of concern that with the increasing crisis, the expanding crisis in Europe, and the fact that this is going to be a medium to long term. This conflict will not end tomorrow, unfortunately. That much of this aid will be diverted. The aid that was coming to this region will now be diverted to Europe. Can you maybe say a few words about this and talk us through this, how to think through this space?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Maha, and thanks for having me. And I think Jihad covered some of those main impacts, because obviously the economic impact, food security impact will be, a huge part of the humanitarian picture. But specifically on humanitarian agencies, we've learned that half of all of the World Food Programme's wheat is sourced from Ukraine. And I think, similarly large amount of cooking oil, for example. So that kind of impact directly on humanitarian operations is going to have an impact for supplies of specifically for humanitarian use of those basic goods across the region. And I think that there will be obviously this financial and food or food security access shock, and that's coming on the back of at least 2 years of COVID shocks, and then of course other shocks in the region for different reasons in each particular country. The financial issues and poverty and so forth are already crushing Syria. There was talk of famine in that country prior to the conflict in Ukraine. Lebanon has a huge economic crisis. Turkey has its own economic problems, and also, Jordan further afield, everybody is really struggling already. So we're not starting from a great baseline.
I was just adding Yemen and Libya as well, so.
Yeah, and I think when you talk about the aid budgets, it was really notable yesterday that Yemen only raised, I think it was a third of the amount that they were pitching for at their major donor conference for the year. So we will see those already stretched humanitarian budgets stretched even further with this massive crisis to deal with in Ukraine, with the huge amount of displacement and so forth. Whether projects like the much discussed sort of Jordan, Syria, Lebanon electricity deal continue will also have an impact on, people's humanitarian situation, whether they have access to electricity. There was hopes that would alleviate some of that. We don't know what the status of those is anymore. In Syria specifically, the future of the cross-border resolution is in doubt with the end of the United States-Russian bilateral discussions that were driving those negotiations. So that's up for renewal in just a couple of months. And that's obviously a concern for Turkey. It could plunge that area into an even worse humanitarian situation. And then with knock-on effects in Turkey, or a destabilizing effect as well. And I think we'll also find resettlement places will become more difficult. Pathways out of the region for refugees who are sort of stuck in really difficult economic circumstances in host countries that have difficult economic circumstances, where they're feeling that push factor to return or to make uncomfortable choices. Those pathways through the Med or, through other countries are just going to be much harder. Resettlement places will be harder. I think they'll find, even fewer opportunities for safe shelter outside of the region.
Emma, can we talk about double standards? We've seen a lot of this in the past few weeks in the way, both in the way some media personalities were presenting this, talking about, these are the civilized refugees. This was one, many journalists said that, but there was also in the way refugees are being treated. The whole coverage of this, can we talk about double standards? Reception towards the plight of Ukrainians, etc.
I think if you break it down, there's yeses and then some, it remains to be seen. Obviously, the rhetoric was very, very problematic and continues to be problematic. I saw more clips this morning that were just, really very challenging to listen to. I think in terms of the diplomatic, military, economic response to this, yes, it's been a huge surprise. It's, a completely different style of response than we saw to Syria, for example. And I think that's a shock to most people who are watching, a surprise to the region, and of course, as Paul said earlier, I think to Russia themselves. But I think there's a temptation to sort of take some of those things and see it as a blanket truth. And when you see the frustration of the Ukrainians to the fact that they can't get the no-fly zone and so forth, they're starting to see some of those limits that other places have seen over the last few years, that, even with this big response, there are limits. And I think in Syria, we saw a welcoming response, certainly in the beginning, from neighboring states, offering shelter to people, which is what Ukraine is seeing from their neighbors. We didn't see the kind of welcome that, people from the region, people from Ukraine are getting, afforded necessarily to people from the region when they try to get to Europe. So there's certainly a difference there. And it appears now like aid is pouring into Ukraine, but we are a few weeks in. And I think, having just heard that statistic about Yemen, it would be interesting to see where we are, in 5 years, 2 years, 10 years time with that kind of outpouring of aid, and whether we do sort of, whether there's differences or actually really, unfortunately, some similarities in how that goes in the longer term.
Thanks, Emma. Let's zoom out again and back to you, Paul, and kind of the more geopolitical space. We've seen the Ukraine war, that the Ukraine war has reinforced pre-existing alliances between Europe and US. But we also saw other countries hedging their bets. You had already talked a little bit about this. For example, the Gulf countries Israel has hedged its bets as well in terms of trying to support Ukraine, but not upset Russia, given the deep connections between both countries, their mutual interests in Syria. So what can you tell us about the way forward, especially on the Russia-Israel-US trilateral relations? I mean, we've seen Prime Minister Bennett visit Moscow, et cetera, offering, to host again peace talks in Jerusalem. Where do you see this going?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think, one of the things that, when you look at the war from the perspective of Brussels or the perspective of Washington, you see a sort of a very strong effort to isolate Russia. But I think when you actually really look at that, Russia is isolated from, Europe, it's isolated from the United States, and it's isolated from Canada. But it still has lots of points of engagement, both on the economic as well as the diplomatic. Economic, because of the sanctions, are certainly going to be much more challenging for all countries involved, because everybody is watching, but also the potential of unknowingly messing up in how you engage with Russia and violating sanctions and repercussions it could have either in Europe or the United States. However, I actually strongly welcome the fact that many countries like Israel, like the Gulf, are keeping their ties open. I think this is important. I think we've talked a lot about the Ukrainian refugees, but there's also an outflow of Russians leaving the country too. We've seen a harsh, clampdown, and countries like the Gulf, countries in the Middle East, Turkey, Israel are all very important destinations for those people. And I think, yes, I mean, Russia is we're seeing a lot of hedging. We're seeing a lot of countries sort of try to, continually engage Russia. Some of this is old school sort of balancing acts that we've seen in other places. But I think the fact that some of these countries are really powerful and really important to Russia, like Israel, the Gulf, Turkey, that does, give a way for, negotiations. I don't have a whole lot of hope. But these are places where Russia needs to have positive relations because of Syria, positive relations because of Libya, and then with Turkey, positive relations because of all around the Black Sea, where Russia and Turkey are bumping into each other. So I think these are important lines of maybe not de-escalation, but making sure that things don't even get any worse, although they might very well might. But I think we are. I personally welcome these efforts of these other states. I think some in the U.S. Political spectrum do too, but I think there's probably a lot of pressure on them too. It just depends whether you're a real realist or whether you are very ideological in how you want to push back on Russia.
Paul, let me just follow up very quickly on this. Then, how do you see the conflict impacting the JCPOA? We've seen some discussion about Russia asking as a precondition that all its trade with Iran will not be sanctioned, which apparently is now there's an acceptance of that. So at the same time, if the JCPOA gets signed, this will also help, as Sinan was saying, this will also help in terms of oil production globally. So how do you see this conflict possibly impacting? We know how the JCPOA will impact the region, but how do you see the Ukraine conflict?
I think Iran is one of those very touchy issues in U.S.-Russian relations and and involving the EU as well. I do think as oil prices go through the roof here in the United States and particularly in Europe. There is a keen desire to find alternate supplies. So there is a lot of discussion here on on re-engaging, not just Iran, but also Venezuela, which is more key towards the United States. But places that we have not been engaging with. Whether or not that will play out, I think there is certainly less resistance in Europe and particularly the United States towards that. But Russia, this is one of the areas. Most of the lines of communication and most of the places where U.S. European and Russian, strategic interests could align. This was one of the places where many people thought that could happen, but I think we've really seen a breakdown in all of these, and so Russia could certainly play a spoiler in this, particularly because, as you say, it has demands as well, and so I think. They're going to try to use this to sort of, for sanctions relief, to try to de-isolate and to sort of reinsert themselves into a global issue and complicate, the ability of other powers to sort of move forward on this. So I think this is just, an added new complication, and the fact that, most of the discussions that are happening between, between Washington and Moscow now, they're concerning Ukraine, they're concerning nuclear issues, they're concerning, the threats of chemical weapons in Ukraine. I mean, that was just yesterday, and we're really seeing some of these others. Although there's a push, there's not a really desire to really have to push with Moscow and deal with Moscow on these issues. So I think it's this is potentially a huge spoiler.
Potentially, but I think, the one thing is that there is at least there's one agreement, which is I think neither Russia nor the US want to see a nuclear Iran. So
yeah, that's true.
In terms of Iran, we may see some movements there, though how this will impact, again, going back to Israel's capacity to act pretty freely to bomb Iranian positions in Syria, etc. All of this is kind of up for question at this point, and it's not clear where things will be going. Yep. Sinan, let me turn to you now and ask you about the impact of the Ukraine war on Russia and Turkey's adversarial collaboration in places, specifically in places like Syria and Libya. And basically, more as a follow-up to this, how long do you think President Erdogan, for how long will he be able to walk this fine line and juggle all these different balls that you described so eloquently earlier?
Yes, and the real risk in terms of the downside and is on Syria for Turkey, and there are a couple of things there. One, even though perhaps this decision has not been interpreted to the extent that I think it is warranted, Turkey's decision to close the straits to Russian warships. And I just want to spend, just very briefly on how that happened and what it means. Turkey is the custodian of the Montreux Treaty, dating back to 1936. So it has the power to regulate the passage of ships. This regime has two different dimensions: one for civilian ships and one for warships. Now, when the war started in Ukraine, the Turkish government decided that it was indeed a war. As you know, the Russian terminology is a special military operation. So Russians don't, describe these events as a war. Nonetheless, the Turkish government did. And once it did describe this as a war, it triggered the Article 19 of the Montreux Convention, which essentially obliges Turkey to close the straits to the passage of warships of belligerent nations, in this case, Russia and Ukraine, but obviously it has an impact on Russia mostly. There are some exceptions to that decision. So warships that belong to the Black Sea Fleet should be able to, go back to their home port. But in essence, the decision is there. Now, what this does is that it doesn't really change a whole lot the already existing very big asymmetry between Russia and Ukraine in the Black Sea. but it does something else. Once the ships cross, the Russian warships cross the straits, they are stuck in the Black Sea. They cannot go back to the Mediterranean, which is, going to be a major hindrance for Russian logistical efforts and power projection ability in Syria. Because what we have seen in the past is that the Black Sea fleet, including the submarines, were being used by Russia for power projection to Syria and also for some logistical purposes. That link is now broken. Now, it may not matter for the short term, but imagine the scenario where there's no peace, where we end up in a protracted war scenario. Then Turkey will not be able to lift and will not want to lift this obligation regarding the closure of the strait. So going forward, this is going to be a major handicap for Russia in Syria. So that's the first angle that perhaps was not emphasized enough as a consequence of this decision. So the more we go, the more Russia will then want to pressure the Turkish government and claim that the war is over and Turkey should return to the statu quo ex ante. And there, obviously, the Turkish government will need to decide. Secondly, with regard to Syria, and that's been one particular reason why Turkey has been careful with regard to its policy towards Russia. But if indeed we find ourselves in a scenario of even greater acrimony and tension between the West and Russia, the question of how balanced Turkish policy will remain vis-a-vis Moscow is really a question mark. And then the fear is that the relationship with Russia over Syria is going to break down. The Astana process itself is going to break down. With all the complications that might entail for Turkey, the humanitarian dimension, the security dimension, and so on. Thirdly, Russia's involvement in Syria as an external actor, given its influence over the regime, was also important vis-a-vis the prospect of an eventual political settlement in Syria. But Russia is not the only actor there. There are other actors, including the US, Turkey, Iran, and of course, the regime itself. So what happens to the prospect of a even, long-term peaceful, settlement in Syria if you have a Russia that is not anymore able to talk to the Western countries, and particularly the US? So the overall tension between Russia and the West in an environment where there is a security dimension, where there are heavy sanctions, I would tend to believe that it will have, unfortunately, a very negative impact on the prospect of a peaceful settlement, of a lasting settlement for Syria as well. And that's also bad news for Turkey.
This is bad news all around, unfortunately. It obviously complicates an already very complicated situation, and the potential of a peace settlement in Syria, I think, are becoming more and more remote. Do you want to add anything about Libya in particular, and especially given that Russia uses the Wagner Group, but also Turkey and Russia have also a very tenuous relationship in Libya, if I may describe it as such?
Yes, indeed. Just like at the beginning in Syria, in Libya as well, Turkey and Russia were in opposing camps. Turkey given strong backing to the government in Tripoli, even supporting it militarily, which possibly was a game changer with regard to the events on the ground in Libya. Turkey's support to the Tripoli government, which was able to withstand and then reverse the direction of travel of the fight against Haftar. The Russian side had supported the Haftar camp, but ultimately, and this is again very interesting, is that despite this, Turkey and Russia having backed different corners, they ended up partnering in a diplomatic initiative for Libya, One of them took, one of the top-level meetings with the different Libyan factions, with the participation of Turkey and Russia, took place in Moscow before they traveled to Berlin last year. So indeed, there is, the perfect, if you want, illustration of how both, combative but also cooperative Turkey's relationship with Russia is. Now, going forward in Libya, the influence of those two countries, Turkey and Russia, have perhaps become a bit less palpable, given that the international community, the UN, took a larger political role and initiative. But of course, now with the fate of the elections up in the air, the positioning of these two countries will continue to matter. But from a Turkish perspective, Syria is much closer to our set of major concerns than right now what happens in Libya.
Okay. Thanks, Sinan. There's a question for you in the chat about how to explain, but you've already covered most of this, why Turkey is the only one out of 30 NATO countries not to impose sanctions on Russia, and then to continue opening its skies, etc. Planes, give shelter to oligarchs and act as a black marketeer. You've already touched on most of this in your conversation, unless you want to add something to...
Well, maybe one additional detail to add is that since the beginning of the conflict, despite this, balanced policy, Turkey was one of the very few NATO countries. Imagine the early times where Germany even, was trying to block the transfer of weapons. Turkey was supplying armed drones to Ukraine.
Okay. And those drones have had actually quite a significant impact on the conflict. Jihad, let me turn back to you and ask you about the impact on the conflict in Syria. We're in a situation today where there is a stalemate. We have multiple factions on the ground. I think everybody seems to be in a wait-and-see mode at this point. But how do you see things developing militarily, given, again, the US, Russia, Turkish engagement in Syria? Will we see attempts to gain concessions, use proxy forces? How do you see things moving? There's a lot of concern around Idlib and the potential of movements in Idlib. The Kurds are very worried that any kind of deal would come at their own expense, and they'll be thrown on the bus one more time. So.
Yes, Maha. Of course, there's a lot of concern actually in Damascus on a number of aspects. I talked earlier of the impact of the surge in the price of commodities on the society. But even before we look at the politics, if we look at the economics, I mean, beyond that, we also need to know that Syria, having been under sanctions for quite a while, for now at least a dozen years, the Syrian government, the central bank, has most of its reserves, well, we believe so at least, has most of its reserves stocked in Russian banks. At one point, it had up to $2 billion in VTB, which is one of the banks that were removed from the SWIFT network a couple of weeks ago. The Russian banks were also used for transactions with the outside world. So this is something that, Syrian banks won't be able to do. There's also a fear that, the humanitarian aid, which today represents a significant part of the currency that enter the economy and feed the economy, but the humanitarian aid is going to drop significantly because a lot of it is going to go to, the EU is going to focus on Ukrainian refugees, the EU being the main donor of funds. So from the economic and financial angle, there's a lot of concern. Now, from the political one, Damascus is quite worried. Now, when we need to remember one thing is that when the Russians recognized Donetsk and Luhansk as two independent republics, the only other country, or at least the first country to recognize them, was Damascus. And that move was actually very criticized in Damascus because of the Kurdish issue. And a lot of people in Damascus basically told the regime, why are you doing that? Because now there's an excuse for people within a sovereign state declaring independence. So that has created some friction, and you have even had, I will share maybe an article we translated in Al Watan, a state-owned newspaper, saying, no, don't worry, there won't be any problem. Ukraine and the Northeast are two different, unrelated issues, but it was a reflection of the concerns there. There is also a concern in Damascus, of course, that at the isolation of Moscow, because Moscow was really playing a role or pushing or helping the Syrian regime normalize its relations with the West, and the isolation of Moscow makes it, of course, more difficult for Damascus to do that. There's, of course, concern that the focus in Moscow will shift. Not really that there will be a trade-off, because the big problem is actually nobody wants really, no one's, I mean, if Moscow were to sell Syria, but there's no one to buy Syria, really. And I think the whole Western, everybody is pretty happy about the status quo. But still, there is a concern that there is a change of focus, and that in a potential big deal at one point, the regime could pay the price. And worst case scenario for the regime, at least, is a change of regime in Moscow, which is and a big change in strategy in Moscow. It's not, of course, forthcoming. I mean, it's not something that is now in the short term likely to happen, but this is something that could happen in the medium to long term. So all of these are a source of concern in Damascus. Just today, the rate of the dollar, for instance, which had stabilized at around 3,500 pounds for more than a year now in the black market, crossed the 4,000 pound level. So, and that's a reflection of all these this combination of concerns in the country.
That's actually quite interesting. But just to go back to the issue of Idlib in particular, which is the more immediate concern, do you see the possibility of a move in Idlib as a way to possibly pressure Turkey to disrupt the status quo? I mean,
to be frank, I think, I mean, that will be a consequence of Russian-Turkish relation. It is true that the Turks have been supplying, these drones to the Ukrainians, but as one of the audience said, I mean, Turkey is today the only NATO country to have not have closed its skies to Russia. Turkey is and will remain a client of Russian gas. I think the Russians want to keep the Turks on board. They understand, I imagine, that Turks are also under pressure, and I see it now very unlikely that the Turks, that the Russians will escalate in Idlib. To some extent, today the Russians need the Turks as much as the other way around. So I don't see this happening today in Idlib.
We're also seeing a move apparently to get Syrian fighters to go to Ukraine. We've been hearing of increasing conscription campaigns with the, I don't want to say support, but with the know-how, with the knowledge of the regime. What we're understanding is that they're giving them a pass, saying, you can go, you won't be considered a martyr if you die there, but however, we'll allow you to defer your military conscription. Or
yeah, I mean, unfortunately, this is extremely, I mean, what can you say? That's again one more stage in the big Syrian catastrophe that we have been seeing for the past 12 years. I mean, they've been promised money, of course. I think the regime is necessarily going to allow this, but it's also telling that some people within the regime ranks are opposing this. For instance, I've seen a couple of days ago a tweet from Faris Shabi, the head of the Aleppo Chamber of Commerce, a hardcore regime loyalist, saying, Ukraine is not our war, Syrians should not go and fight there. So there is really debate on both sides, actually, among Syrians that, this isn't our battle. We shouldn't go and fight there. But, I mean, as I said, the Syria is the first country to have recognized these two republics. The regime is very dependent on Moscow, has quite little margin of maneuver, and I don't think it has much choice. At least it certainly doesn't have the choice of blocking. It may not encourage, but also don't forget, a lot of people need money, want money, and are sending their young men to go and die for a few $100s.
Just one last question before I turn to Emma. Can you give us a sense of how you see Russia, Iran, Syria relationships developing over the next few months? I don't want to say a few years. Do you see Iran possibly, given that it seems more likely now that the JCPOA may be signed in a few weeks? Do you see Iran gaining a better foothold in Syria as Russia becomes more preoccupied elsewhere? How do you see this developing?
Well, clearly the balance of power between the two actors is changing, but really since the Russian intervention around 7 years ago, every one of the two countries has really needed the other one. Everyone is filling a gap that the other country cannot fill. And I think that as long as the Russians want to stay in Syria and will need the Russians, will need the Iranians will need also the Russian, the air cover they can provide to them. So what one could imagine is a strengthening of the relation with strengthening of the role of Iran and of the influence of Iran relative to Russia. However, when you look at the Syrian scene, Russia, Iran, Turkey are important actors. Another important actor is Israel, of course. Israel, which is going, I think, to benefit in many ways from the conflict, more immigration, capital inflow from the oligarch, more gas exports, intermediation role between Ukraine and Russia, more security provided to the Gulf countries because given the U.S. withdrawal and the Russian absence. So I think Israel is today a big player in the area. I think there will be even less restriction by the Russians on Israeli attacks on Syria. And so it's quite complex actually to judge how this is going to move between these different actors. But certainly we are going to see in the next few months all of them trying to seek a new equilibrium between them.
Okay, no, I could not agree more. It's many moving pieces at the same time. Yeah. Emma, let me turn to you now and ask you about the impact of the crisis on political negotiations and the political process in Syria. How do you see that moving forward?
Yeah, I think obviously consolidated the three areas even more, and a settlement I think is further away than it was, not that it was, particularly close before. As Jihad said, Damascus haven't really covered themselves in glory by being the closest to Moscow on the announcement at that time. We're seeing a bit of a pivot away from this normalization narrative that was starting to get a bit of traction earlier in the year. The Arab League meeting on Syria has been delayed till at least November. But I think on that, there's a bit of a wait and see because there is likely to be a changing approach from the region, I think, as they begin to balance fears of destabilization due to the fallout of Ukraine, and what they perceive to be sort of likely Western, disinterest or withdrawal to some degree. But that will have to be balanced by the fact that sort of being closer to Russia, and the regime has never been more unpopular. And that will have kind of an impact on, the UAE and others from whom the regime in Russia in particular were banking on reconstruction assistance from. And I think, even some of the diplomacy that's been going on in terms of peeling BRICS countries away from Russia on this particular action will have an impact there as well. And on the political process itself, I think, it's obviously not great news. The step-for-step process will be much more difficult now. It was already going to be an enormous challenge to get political will on that, but it's not really a time people are going to be wanting to give major concessions to, Russia or the regime, or be particularly trusting of, those sort of dialogues or promises. And I think we also have a more immediate issue, which is, next week we see the Constitutional Committee meeting, which is happening. And I think we've suddenly seen a lot of interest from Russia and the regime on this committee meeting, which we've not really seen before. And for them, it is a bit of a diplomatic win to be able to go to an international negotiation that isn't one of the critical, urgent ones, the JPCOA or, the ceasefire talks about the Ukraine. This is actually, an additional diplomatic channel where they are able to go and participate at a time where they're not particularly welcome elsewhere. And I think that does create a real challenge for the opposition and civil society lists of people, they're called lists, groups, and their constituencies, and I use constituency in the broadest sort of sense. A lot of them are having a really challenging time right now, watching what they have been through occur somewhere else, watching other people go through what they've gone through. I've talked to a lot of people who are finding it, emotionally really, really difficult to sit with. And they're going to be very critical and find it very challenging that the people representing them are going off to this forum at this particular time to sit down, in that kind of dialogue. And I think that that's potentially, a worrying moment for one of the channels within that process that actually is working. So yeah, I think not great news in the immediate term on the political process.
Thank you, Emma. I'm going to go to a question from the audience. Perhaps you can answer this. The question is that if the Syrian regime is relying increasingly on humanitarian aid and aid changes, what changes can we expect in their way of engaging humanitarian actors, basically, and donors? Will there be increased scrutiny, demands, etc.? This is a question from our audience.
In terms of the donors' approach, I think that we've recently been seeing, a bit more oversight from donors on how that assistance is being used, on trying to make sure, particularly as there is this move towards longer term programming to early recovery and livelihoods work, then that some of that is starting to happen in a slightly different way. It's obviously not happening in anything like the way that it should be happening, and I think that pressure does need to continue. But what we've also seen increasing, this dates back before the invasion of Ukraine, but it's certainly ramped up in the last couple of weeks, are the demands from Russia and the regime to expand that early recovery and livelihoods work, including sort of misunderstanding or misrepresentation of the text of Resolution 2585, which talked about early recovery and livelihoods work, but didn't write a blank check for all early recovery and livelihoods work. And we've seen, the government of Syria, I think it was this week, or in the last few days at least, begin to try to put a mandate on all INGOs, not just the UN, to be doing that kind of work as well if they want to continue to work in the country. So we are going to see a lot more pressure on those actors, certainly, and whether they can meet that pressure and push back on some of the concerns that we've seen, I think does remain to be seen. But there are some efforts going on, but certainly more could be done.
Thank you, Emma. Let me come back to Paul and Sinan, both of you. Paul, first, there's a question that is from the audience as well, that's looking at, basically, it's looking at Saudi Arabia's refusal to increase oil production and what that means for China. So that's one question. But I wanted to ask the two of you particularly a question about sanctions as well. We just came, right before this panel, we were on a Carnegie-wide discussion where many of us, many spoke about the sanctions, not only the kind of, full-blown support we've seen from Western countries, the rush, the strongest sanctions regime we've seen anywhere, with the exception of Iran, and yet the implications of what this means. Not everybody is on board with sanctions, as you've both mentioned earlier, but also the role of sanctions as a political, as a diplomatic tool, and then the implications of this on ordinary Russians and their lives and livelihoods. Paul, let me begin with you, and then I'll go to Sinan. First on China, and then on sanctions, and then Sinan.
Hi. So on the sanctions issue, I do think these are unprecedented, and these shocked the Russian government. The Russian government, has been used to sanctions since 2014, and thought that they had the ability to withstand them. But what we're seeing is sanctions on technology that are key to keeping up the Russian economy. We are seeing global sort of de facto embargoes on transportation going into Russia. This has deep impacts, I think, for not only is it difficult to get into the Black Sea, and is it not all that safe, and we're seeing disruptions in grain supply, but even the ability to get the grain out. And so we're seeing broader impacts, and these are not necessarily just because of sanctions. These are because countries can't or shippers can't insure their lines going in, and we see lots of companies pulling out proactively from the region. And I don't think Russia was really expecting this. But there's a the Russian government can probably withstand some of this. We're seeing record oil prices. They've got a lot parked in gold, and so it certainly hurts. It hurts Russian industry, but what I think it really is doing is it's hurting both the Russian people, and it has trickle down effects on other countries as well. We're seeing inflation go up. We are seeing Russians being cut off from payment systems. This is a particularly big problem because of the cutoff of SWIFT and MasterCard, Visa. This is a particularly big problem for all of those people who are leaving Russia, the exiles and the brain drain, because they might be able to get to Israel, but they have no money or no access to their money once they get there. And so we are seeing, this really hit the Russian people and their ability to, pay for, the essential things that they need, and everything from repairing an airplane to repairing a car. Now car parts are much harder to get. So these are strong sanctions. And I think some of these might have to be walked back at some point, simply because the impacts on humans and on neighboring countries are really big.
Do you want to say a few words about China? Maybe we haven't touched on China and its position in the vis-a-vis this conflict.
Well, China is, I would say China in some ways is hedging, but certainly hedging more on Russia's side in here. It certainly does not like the precedent of what Russia is doing. China has pushed back at the idea of intervening in neighboring in other countries' affairs. It doesn't like the fact that Russia has stoked separatism throughout this region. But when you look at it, and I'm not sort of saying the West and the international system is not at fault for this, but China has really, in the diplomatic sphere, has really not so much in the UN where it's abstaining, but in its engagements and public statements, it is putting as much blame on NATO as it is on Russia. But in reality, it is Russia that actually moved their troops and is bombing civilians right now. But this does certainly transform Russian Chinese relations. In 2014, we really saw Russia try to pivot towards Asia, but its most successful pivot was actually towards China. It became far more dependent on Chinese financing and Chinese technology. I think that will continue. And the difficulties the Russian military has had, I think they've requested Chinese military assistance, whether or not that's coming or not. But I certainly think this is giving China a lot more sway over Russia, and I think in some ways, whether or not it will move towards greater acceptance of the Chinese currency as a global currency. I think it's we're seeing that, and we're just going to see that as a way to get around sanctions. But I think we're still a little bit off in sort of seeing a definitive shift in that direction in the next few days, but next few years. But I think we really have seen a huge shift in the power dynamics in that relationship between Russia and China.
Could not agree more. Sinan, let me turn to you with the same questions on sanctions and on...
Let me start with an interesting observation on sanctions. Now, one of the heaviest sanctions that have so far been imposed on Russia has been the decision to freeze the Russian central bank's assets in Europe and the United States. So the question and the observation is, and this is not a non-significant sum. We're talking about probably between $300 to $340 billion of central bank assets that have been frozen. So the question that this triggers, this is a country that is planning to wage war on Ukraine, and then leaves half of its central bank assets abroad in Europe and in the US where they can be targeted. So how does this happen? And I think from here, the answer that sort of I got is that most probably even the highest people within the Russian hierarchy, including the governor of the central bank, did not know that, war was coming. And this points you to, my sort of remarks on the sanctions, which is that the impact of sanctions on authoritarian regimes is very different than impact of sanctions on democratic societies. If there are one, in general, and this is to some extent what we have seen in Iran, there is a incongruence of interests between the leadership and society at large when they are faced with sanctions. Because what sanctions do is that on the one hand, as discussed here, it leads to a pauperization of the population. Their purchasing power is eroded, their incomes are cut down. But at the same time, it gives more economic room for the oligopolistic system that runs the country. This is what we've seen in Iran, with the economy that is increasingly come under the control of the Revolutionary Guards, for instance. So the impact in Iran of the sanctions has been very different depending on who controls the economy, especially if you're talking about a oligopolistic market structure or monopolistic market structure. So I think this is one thing that we have to bear in mind as we try to understand the impact of sanctions, because if these sanctions are indeed designed to force regime change in Russia after this most egregious violation of international law and norms, then it's going to be very, very difficult to foresee, because even if the population suffers from it, the cost of leadership actually benefits from it, to the extent that they control now an economy that's going to be more introverted and therefore more oligopolistic and close to competition. And on top of that, you have the perverse impact on oil and gas prices, which fuels the state's coffers when you have a period of geopolitical tension. So in a way, how the sanctions policy, which in the previous meeting, Maha, I've tried to underline that it has become, centerfold in the Western response. And this is something totally new, because yes, we've seen it to some extent with Iran, but Russia is a different subject. And the Western response being so much focused on sanctions rather than, deterrence, hardcore deterrence, is going to be, a very complex, is going to lead to very complex consequences. Because even before the war, the sanctions policy was designed to be used as deterrence instead of hardcore deterrence. So economic deterrence was the, favorite path. That failed. Now sanctions policy has turned more into an act to penalize the Russian leadership rather than deterrence. But of course, this has some, the law of unintended consequences, because this very heavy sanctions policy also tends to penalize other societies, not just Russians. And therefore, this balance between, how far the West is willing to go in raising the costs, not only to Russia, but also other countries that either have a relationship with Russia or even don't have a relationship with Russia. Through inflation, through higher oil and food prices, is going to be, a very difficult proposition as we go forward, and as we revisit the overall sanctions policy. And the last thing that I want to say here is particular with regard to the United States. In the past, the type of U.S. sanctions that we have seen on Russia has also had an impact called secondary sanctions. So not only did they impact Russia, but also they also impacted countries that carried out transactions with the sanctioned Russian entities. So whether this new sanctions package, and here I'm particularly talking about China, whether this new sanctions package will have not only the second order type impact that we discussed, but also whether they include specific secondary sanctions that can affect, third countries, is also something to be watched carefully. So I know I raised more questions than answers, but this is where we are, unfortunately.
Indeed, it is where we are. We're coming towards the end of our broadcast. I'm going to turn to you now, Jihad, with a question also from the audience, and then I will turn to each of you for final comments, if you'd like to give any. Jihad, there's a question about the rise in oil prices from the audience, and the fact that this has been a windfall for Gulf countries, obviously. And the question really is this going to fuel an additional arms race in the region, literally? The question is for all the speakers, but I fielded it to Jihad. So please feel free to pitch in if you would like to on this issue. Go ahead, Jihad.
Yeah. I mean, it is obviously very possible. I mean that this is going to to push the countries of the region to buy more weapons. I mean, I think the more strategic change really is the leverage the Gulf countries have really today. I think what is interesting about the China Russia debate, it also applies to the China Gulf debate. And I think one of the questions also, Maha, if you allow, was whether has been a debate about whether the Saudis are going to use the yuan, the Chinese currency. And that's very telling, because obviously the use of a currency is also symbolic of the power of that currency and of the country that issues that currency. And it is a reflection, of course, of the dependency of China on Gulf countries. China buys a lot of its oil from the Gulf, and the Gulf buys a lot of its products from China. So in a certain sense, it would make sense for the Saudis to sell it all in yuan. However, the decision is really a political one. And it is very likely that the spreading rumors of the Saudis potentially using yuan is something which is done by the Saudis to extract more concessions from the US, including, for instance, selling weapons or simply, changing their position with regards to Iran, getting more political support or military support. So really what we are seeing today, we are witnessing, before our eyes, and therefore we certainly need some time to digest all of that. But the war is leading us, is one more step toward, a realignment and a significant geopolitical change in the region, because we have one major middle power such as Russia, which is weakening. We have the US, which is withdrawing. We have China, which depends a lot on the Gulf. Where is this going to take us to? It's not clear. And we have, of course, as we mentioned, all this is happening while the JCPOA is likely to be signed. Therefore, a return of Iran to the oil market, and an improvement in the economic situation in Iran and the capacity of Iran to finance its war machine again. So all of these really is very interesting to watch.
No, it's also additional funding to its own proxies, Jihad, which will have a knock-on effect, obviously, on Syria, on Lebanon, on Yemen, and possibly other places as well. So it is a lot of questions. I think we are raising a lot more questions than we are answers in this session, but it's the nature of the moment. Emma, let me turn to you now with any maybe final comments you'd like to make. I mean, we've
I think we've talked about, the impact of Ukraine on the region, but there's also, the lessons from Russia's involvement in the region for Ukraine. And I think that that's something that, warrants a little bit of attention, as we're thinking about all of this. And I think there's a whole host of lessons from, having seen the way that Russia has engaged in Syria in particular over the last decade, that we can take into the Ukrainian context. And of course, the context there is very different, but there's, a huge number of similarities and lessons. And I guess the biggest recommendation or some, there would be to learn from the past, to learn from the way that Russia has engaged in the conversations about humanitarian corridors, in the way that they have engaged with, the role of the UN, with conversations about humanitarian notification systems, particularly when we see things like, by yesterday there had been 43 attacks on hospitals, which is something that we've just watched over and over and over again in the region. Learning from that, learning from all of the steps that were taken over the last 10, 11 years as these things played out in that context, and applying them to the way that, the humanitarian aid response is working, from some of the incredible technologies and techniques, and processes that were developed in Syria, the IIIM, the snazzy diplomacy to sort of navigate some of the issues that were going on at the Security Council that we see continuing, this week with the resolution draft that's going on about, Ukraine humanitarian access, and really digging into sort of where we have seen all of this before, and how we could maybe, just be a little smarter, a little more ahead of the game this time, so we don't, watch this whole sort of playbook play out again over the next 10 years.
Can you give maybe one or two examples? I mean, you and I have had this conversation, and you put out an article recently where you talked about, for example, how humanitarian corridors would be open, but not necessarily to where people really wanted to go.
Right.
How diplomacy would happen hand in hand with sieges.
Yeah, and I think that's a perfect example. It felt silly to raise it because obviously, those corridors in the Syrian context were from, encircled enclaves of sort of opposition that were within, the regime's territory. And so sort of raising the fact that people didn't want to leave into those territories, whether that would apply to Ukraine because it's a different context. And then we saw Russia offering people humanitarian corridors that went into Russia. So even in a context where it seemed unlikely they would apply some of these techniques, because of the geography and so forth, that's exactly what they did. There's been a humanitarian notification system set up already, but we've seen these 43 attacks on hospitals. There has to be a way to escalate that when it happens. We have to be able to navigate or change the system to have accountability for it to be raised in the highest levels of diplomacy. When there's a draft tabled at the Security Council that doesn't refer to Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty, and which tries to push all of the humanitarian response through the UN, which then has complicated issues with regard how they can relate to Russia. Obviously, yes, it's very different in the Ukrainian context. It's not Syria, but there are some components of giving all of that control over to an organization like that, rather than leaving the space for INGOs, NGOs, civil society, all of the functioning government that still exists in Ukraine to be able to take on some of those responsibilities. We do see some of these sneaky tricks, and it does require, that fine reading and that sort of assumption of perhaps not totally good faith from the other side in tackling some of those things before they happen.
Thanks, Emma. Sinan, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, before we close, if I may, I think one of the major themes and dilemmas that we will need to explore in coming years is how is this war going to change the balance between the what we hear from the Biden government, what we hear from many leaders in Europe about their willingness to promote democracy and fundamental freedoms. Biden just, a few months ago organized the Democracy Summit, and the now more, security-focused environment. There's a lot of parallels drawn with the Cold War. Some of them may be relevant, some of them less so. But nonetheless, what we know of the Cold War is that these values like democracy, fundamental rights, rule of law, did not appear very high on the agenda of Western policymakers because they were faced with a environment where they felt that having allies on the security front mattered more. Now, are we going to go back to that era? And therefore, now with Russia becoming a much more visible threat for many nations in Europe, these security concerns will one more time overweigh this agenda of fundamental freedoms, democracy, and rule of law. And how is there going to be a new balance or are we going to go back to the Cold War times with, particularly with the thinking in Washington and in Brussels? So that's a question that I think is going to shape the geopolitical context of our continent for the years to come.
Thank you. Jihad, you wanted to say something, and then I'll move to Paul for last comments.
Yeah, I mean, maybe this is anecdotal, but it is striking to me that probably for the first time in 40 years, since the Falkland War, over the Falkland Islands in the Malvinas in Argentina, we have a conflict with a global impact and a global media impact that is not involving Arabs. We had in 1990 the Kuwait invasion, in 2001, of course, the 9/11, and then the war on Iraq and Afghanistan. We had the Arab Spring 10 years later, and the repressions by the authoritarian regime, and all this violence, around the world has also contributed a lot to dehumanize the Arabs in a certain sense. And now suddenly we are seeing white people fighting each other. And I think, frankly, when you contacted me first to contribute to that debate, and I was almost a bit relieved to be someone commenting on what impact we may face from other people's wars, and us not being in the big media landscape. Does this mean something about the region? I am not yet sure. We have too much oil in the region for us to have too many hopes that we won't have war again. But I think we need probably to think about it, whether the American withdrawal, the weakening, the peace deal between the Israelis and the Gulf, the JCPOA are not all going to contribute to at least push away a war and violence from this region for a few more years.
I'm not so sure about this, because what we're seeing is really an authoritarian resurgence, but this is a topic for another discussion. Paul, over to you.
Yeah, well, just a couple final thoughts. One was actually on authoritarian resurgence. I mean, I think one of the reasons the Russians were so surprised by the problems they're having in Ukraine is that Ukraine has become a much more democratic place, and people are invested in their localities. And they are, they've gone through a bottom-up street change, which Russia does not recognize anywhere as legitimate. And then they went through one successful, peaceful change at the ballot box. And so what I do think, we are sort of seeing this sort of democratic versus authoritarian, resurgence. I think certainly this is pushing, as Sinan said, pushing the Biden administration and some Europeans, push for democracy promotion, probably under the, to the back burner. But I also think, Russia is keen to use this as, to show its power and to show its appeal as sort of almost like a brand to authoritarians around the world. And so I think, we'll be seeing that. And then just on the Syria question, I think we're already seeing the Russian-Syria playbook play out here in many ways, not just on the humanitarian front. But one of the reasons I'm quite skeptical about the recent peace negotiations, both on the humanitarian corridors, but also on some sort of a ceasefire, is we've seen this before. We've seen Russia go in, engage its adversaries in diplomatic discussions. At the same time, it escalates its targeting of civilian populations. So just as these peace talks have really taken root over the last week, we've seen the Russians target not just the suburbs of the capital Kyiv, but also the center of the capital Kyiv. And we are really seeing a military doctrine where there's a goal of bombing civilian buildings, schools, humanitarian convoys, bread lines, hospitals, you name it. And I think the goal is in part to sort of grow civilian despair and sort of isolate the populations, and with an encourage to try to get them to capitulate and not follow their government. And I think sadly we've seen this in eastern Ukraine, and I think the signs, particularly, this is not what Russia wanted to do. They thought they would come in and be welcomed, but as they experience difficulty, they are then pivoting back to this playbook, and I think that's deeply troubling.
Thank you, Paul. I want to thank each and every one of you, Sinan, Jihad, Paul, and Emma, for what is probably the first, unfortunately, of many conversations on this topic. But thank you for your insights and for a fascinating discussion to be continued. Bye-bye. And thank you to our audience for joining us today, of course, and for everybody who asked questions. Bye, everyone.